Incarceration separates imprisoned people from their families and communities, exposes them to shocking levels of deprivation and abuse, and subjects them to the arbitrary cruelties of the criminal justice system. Yet, as Nicole R. Fleetwood reveals in Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, America's prisons are filled with artists who, working with meager supplies and in the harshest conditions, have found ways to resist brutality and assert their humanity. In this excerpt, she shows that prison art has long been a crucial part of the Black radical tradition. Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration by Nicole R. Fleetwood. As relational practices that connect imprisoned people to larger worlds and possibilities, carceral aesthetics builds on the analysis and cultural production of racial capitalism, gender construction, captivity, and the contours of Black freedom projects in the face of extreme violence and deprivation grounded in the Black radical tradition. Geographer and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, "The Black radical tradition is a constantly evolving accumulation of structures of feeling whose individual and collective narrative arcs persistently tend toward freedom, and that it is shaped by energetically expectant consciousness of and direction toward unboundedness as movement away from partition and exclusion." Many imprisoned Black radicals, especially during the 1970s, produced works of literary, theatrical, and visual art that became important writings and cultural pieces for incarcerated and non-incarcerated people for decades. These works show that prison art is not simply influenced by, but is part of, the Black radical tradition. In fact, one could argue that carceral aesthetics extends the arcs described by Gilmore by demonstrating the significance of culture making and aesthetic transgressions that explode the binary of victory or failure underpinning much political organizing and many social movements. Relatedly, carceral aesthetics offers conceptions of relationality that disavow the systems of value worth, criminalization, and punitive governance of dominant Western art institutions and aesthetics. Art critic and curator Nicholas Buried writes that relational art takes as its theoretical horizon the realm of human interactions and its social context rather than the assertion of an independent and private symbolic space. According to him, relational aesthetics emerge in the context of modernity and globalization, with particular focus on the art practices of the 1990s, spurred by the internet and new modes of gathering, or what Buried describes as greater individual mobility, and the gradual freeing up of isolated places. Art historian Grant Kester critiques Buried's theory of relational aesthetics as a model for collaborative engagement between artists and communities and between artists and the social world as material and site for the production of art. Instead, Kester posits a concept of dialogical practice to develop ways of collaborating and engaging directly with the political stakes of art and the communities impacted. Both Buried and Kester are invested in transformations in the role of art in social life and community engagement, and in the role of the artist as an agent of change. Although they use the language of relationality, they speak to practices that are in conversation with, but not quite what I describe as carceral aesthetics. Carceral aesthetics foregrounds relational modes that emerge inside prisons and are initiated by incarcerated people, and that often are devalued and ignored by art establishments. They are practices that project across carceral divides and that create meaningful engagement not bound by prison. Black radical scholars and artists have examined how racialized penality shapes access to the public life, public knowledge, public good, and public services. They have also troubled the divide between the purported free and unfree in theories of the public and civil society. As scholar Marlon Ross notes, within Black studies, activism, and communities, there is a long established consideration of the unbreakable cultural bonds that exist across seemingly impenetrable prison walls. The voices, philosophies, stories, tunes, and visions of prisons are too often the ordinary stuff of African American life. African American literature, music, philosophy, fashion, visual art, grassroots politics, and social criticism are inseparable from the culture produced by, about, and for the imprisoned. An example of what Ross notes is seen in the efforts of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition to establish prison art and education exchanges in U.S. prisons during the 1970s. Moreover, the Black radical tradition offers a critique of the category of the criminal and a redeployment of it as a strategy for reorganizing marginalized, criminalized, and imprisoned people. The Black radical tradition interrogates carceral logics of freedom and racial discourses and systems that produce Black life as criminal. Moten theorizes that Black artists and musicians are often involved in a juris-generative process of lawmaking and lawbreaking, okay, between sort of legality and criminality. They are not opposed to each other in some simple-ass way. We have been placed under historical conditions that require us to break the law, to disobey. Moten's theorization of the criminal practices of Black artists and thinkers as necessary acts of creativity and freedom resonates with the furtive practices in which incarcerated artists must engage in the production of art, and resignifies the category of the criminal or the prisoner away from stigmatization and toward creativity and collective organizing. Similarly, historian Sarah Haley examines the criminalization and imprisonment of Black women and girls during the Jim Crow era. Haley discusses how Black girls and women were punished for violating white aesthetic projects, focusing on the case of young Black girls convicted of destroying flower pots and taking flowers from the property of white homeowners. Haley documents and analyzes how they were punished harshly and sentenced to convict labor for destroying the aesthetic pleasures of white property rights and in so doing creating a history of no decor. Haley argues that these practices and other acts of criminalized and imprisoned Black women were forms of sabotage, which she defines as the practice of life, living, disruption, rupture, and imagined futures. It is about the development of epistemologies of justice and collectivity, contestations of the binaries produced through Western juridical doctrine, and the individualizing ethos of criminal punishment. Carceral aesthetics also challenges the isolated confinement enforced by penal architecture. Prison art practices foster an alternative formation of the public in which the imprisoned, those under various forms of surveillance, and the seemingly free are viewers and participants, and while it provides a way of seeing and engaging culture that might run counter to state narratives of criminality and imprisonment, aesthetics alone will not topple the carceral state. Yet such practices are fundamental to envisioning freedom and a world without cages. Ndume Alutashuni was sentenced to death in Tennessee for a murder he did not commit. Alutashuni was on death row for 20 years and in prison for 27 before he was released. His journey to freedom involved becoming a student of Black studies and marking art. I understood the issues of race because I grew up in a town where busing started, so coming out of the projects and being bused to white schools and that stuff, I knew about it. I came up in it. I was always aware of what was going on. But yeah, once I found myself convicted of this stuff here, the first 10 years that I was in prison, I chose not to have a TV in my cell. I didn't want to spend endless hours watching TV and not getting nothing done and doing nothing else. There were a lot of brothers around me who were putting books in my hands, and so, I read a lot of history, and Black history, and world history. For me, it was kind of this, even more of a transformation. So, like I said, my art was always informed by knowledge. After the death of his mother, which happened a couple of years into his sentence, Alutashuni fell into despair. Over time, he turned to art for survival, structuring his days around making art, first graphite drawings and eventually paintings. Alutashuni's paintings, like Winds of Change, depict Black people who are unbounded. The works are bright and colorful. Color for him was a way of resisting the sensory deprivation and close confinement of death row cells. I just always wanted to use vibrant colors because color for me was always a form of resistance. You probably know that in most jails and prisons, if you can see the paint on a wall, they're all white, gray, or some dull color. You're in an environment devoid of color. The one thing I knew and understood while I was sitting on death row, the one thing the people couldn't control, was my mind and my thoughts, even though at some point, if they wanted to come in and take me and execute me, they certainly could have did that. But the thing they couldn't do was take my mind. I refused to give that up. Even though you've got me in this colorless environment, you can't stop the color that was actually happening in my head. Through Alutashuni's use of color and depictions of free Black people, he created imaginary worlds and communities that sustained him during his incarceration. While Alutashuni was on death row, his artwork was exhibited in a show arranged by an anti-capital punishment organization, and through the experience he met Anne Marie Moyes, an activist against the death penalty. They developed a relationship and later married. Moyes, inspired partly by her commitment to bringing attention to Alutashuni's case, earned a law degree from Vanderbilt University. She eventually got a large New York law firm to take on his case pro bono. Alutashuni continued to make art and garner support. In 2012, at the age of 54, he was released from prison. During a panel discussion of an exhibition in which his art was featured, Alutashuni stated, "Art literally freed me." No one in the audience dismissed his words as an empty platitude. Since his release, Alutashini continues to make art and works with advocacy groups to end capital punishment and mass incarceration more broadly. While wrongful conviction and innocence are not the focus of my research, Alutashini's experiences in prison for crimes he did not commit fuel his art and activism on behalf of others. The relational possibilities of carceral aesthetics arose during an encounter that happened at a prison art panel and exhibition that I co-organized in the Bronx in 2017. At the end of the panel, which featured 4 formerly incarcerated artists and an art teacher who worked in prisons, a man named AJ raised his hand and said, "I'm here because my father has work in the exhibit. He asked me to come and check it out. I haven't seen his work. I didn't even know that he was an artist." AJ asked the panelists to speak about what making art in prison meant to them. He wanted to know what it meant for his father. Later, he toured the exhibit, smiling and sharing stories of his father. He asked several attendees to pose in front of his father's drawings so that he could send the photos to his father to let him know that he had an audience outside prison for his art. Eddie Cates, AJ's father, was sent to prison in 1991 when AJ was 7. Cates's detailed graphite drawings are based on historical photographs of Black Americans during the Jim Crow era. They depict people working on chain gangs, working as sharecroppers, and as victims of lynching. Cates draws cotton in a detailed, textured light, shaded by the institution of chattel slavery, and by shifting forms of racial capitalism post-slavery. His drawing, Chain Gang, is a reinterpretation of an archival photograph of 4 Black young men, perhaps teens, from the early 1900s. In his interpretation, Cates crops the image and focuses on the features of the incarcerated, in particular, providing great detail of the eyes as they gaze out from under their hats. AJ's presence was especially moving for one of the panelists, J.D. McGuire, an artist and professor who has taught in several prisons. A year earlier, McGuire had taught Eddie Cates in a class at East Jersey State Prison in New Jersey through New Jersey STEP, an association of higher education institutions and state agencies that offer college courses in the state's prisons. McGuire used art to facilitate discussions about racial inequality, American history, and social justice. He created a curriculum called Contraband Scholars, which brought incarcerated art students from 2 facilities into conversation and collaboration, although they remained physically separated. Lessons combined drawing exercises, writing prompts, and analysis of readings and images about social justice, the history of racial captivity and mass incarceration. McGuire shared the works between the 2 prisons so that students in each facility were aware of what the other class was doing. Cates's drawings were assignments from that class. He used the assignments to connect with a history of Black captivity, as well as with fellow incarcerated people who participated in the courses, with teaching artists, with his family, and with a broader, non-incarcerated public. Prison art practices, like of Cates and Alutashani, are largely shaped by the conditions of penal space, penal matter, and penal time, which govern the lives of incarcerated people and structure any attempt to communicate or collaborate with non-incarcerated allies. These conditions also produce the experiences, material, and themes of their contestation. Penal space is the prison itself, the architecture of confinement, but the concept also refers to the disruption of family relations and domestic space, the imposition on movement and mobility, the restrictive and highly monitored experience of the geographic, material, social, and psychic environments in which the incarcerated are warehoused, punished, and surveyed. Gilmore writes, "Prison is not a building over there, but a set of relationships that undermine rather than stabilize everyday lives everywhere. Prisons regulate contact, intimacy, and access at every turn. In so doing, penal space extends beyond the built environment to encompass how carcerality structures relationships through an expansive power to determine life outcomes for populations most impacted by arrest and captivity." Scholar Anup Mirpuri writes, "The ongoing construction of cages and cells, the constant monitoring of those on probation and parole, and the generalized extension of the U.S. surveillance state throughout the social body saturates the political economy of neoliberal capital to such an extent that it may not be possible to localize the prison as a discrete space." In terms of art making, penal space refers to sites in prison where incarcerated people create, such as structured workshops, hobby and crafts rooms, recreational areas, and sometimes alone in isolation cells. It is a concept visualized in Ronnie Goodman's painting, San Quentin Arts in Corrections Art Studio, which depicts a studio where Goodman creates art during his imprisonment. Penal space can also include arenas where art making and the production of culture challenge the restrictions and regulations of prison. Reflecting on her experience teaching and collaborating on a mural project inside a Mexican women's prison, feminist theorist Marissa Ruiz examines both how penal space impacts the logistics of collaborating with imprisoned women and also how art making can potentially transform the very space of penality. Through the process of making murals on prison walls, a collective involving incarcerated and non-incarcerating participants formed, one that constantly pushes at the restrictions and borders of the institution. Ruiz writes, "We came to the conclusion that a story can be developed only by making visible the trespassing of limits and borders, a crossing. The mural text, our visual narration, performs an effect of crossing." She asks, how do captive spaces enable or resist signification? Penal time encompasses the multiple temporalities that impact the lives of the incarcerated and their loved ones. It refers to sentencing guidelines, but also significantly invokes how modern theories of penality turn time into a mode of punishment. Ferguson argues that punishment as time sentenced in prison is flawed, given that most legislators, prosecutors, judges, and others involved in the criminal legal system have no concept of what time feels like inside prison. He queries, can any person at liberty really comprehend what confinement does to time? Can we know what the years actually mean to one serving them in prison? Imprisonment fundamentally reconstitutes being in time as a human subject who senses, observes, and experiences one's environment. Many of the people I interviewed discussed how time moves and functions differently in prison. One formerly incarcerated artist said he kept track of the days by the food served. Prison reconfigures time not only for the imprisoned but also for the inmate relations and social network of the imprisoned. One artist who spent 20 years in prison, from age 25 to 45, commented that during the time he was stuck in a cell, his friends were having children, traveling, and building careers. Penal time also refers to the afterlives of captivity, where many remain tethered by stringent parole, digital monitoring, mandatory drug testing, and other forms of carceral governance. In 2018, Emile DeWeaver was released after spending over 2 decades in California prisons under the condition of lifetime parole. Theorist Stephen Dillon suggests that in prison, time is experienced as a form of slow death. The centrality of death to incarceration undoes normative modes of temporality so that the prisoner is subjected to a space that is timeless. Indeed, the carceral state's dream of the prisoner's future is one of incapacitation, slow death, and nothingness. For the millions of Black, Latinos, Indigenous people, and other dispossessed groups imprisoned or under some form of penal surveillance, penal time exists within centuries-long practices of dispossession and captivity. Temecula Coles colleges, which she made while at Tutwiler Prison and in Birmingham work release, link penal time to other forms of racialized subjugation and precarity. During her imprisonment, Cole participated in Die Jim Crow, an arts initiative created by New York-based producer and activist Fury Young that addresses the historical links of racialized captivity through music and art, with titles like Die Jim Crow, The Movement, The Jim Crow Playbook, Money Games, and Black Lives Splattered. Cole's collages combine composite images from newspapers and magazines of high-profile cases in the criminal legal system and anti-Black violence, placing them alongside images of public figures and celebrities. In so doing, her art makes connections between the carceral state, penal spectatorship, and entertainment culture. Cole's piece, Locked in a Dark Calm, is a composite portrait in which the face at the center of the work is only partially revealed. The figure is enveloped in a gray cloud. At the time that Cole made it, she was taking art classes through the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project, connected with Auburn University. I was constantly trying to reach out and find programs to remind myself that I had self-worth. On the day that she made Locked in a Dark Calm, she states, I was so angry that I wanted to explode because of mistreatment she had experienced from prison staff. She noted that any response from her to the staff would increase her sentence or lead to more discipline. Her only outlet was art. Through the act of creating, she was able to enshroud herself in a state of calm that manifested through the work itself as a visualization of the constraints of penal time and space, and the artist's strategies to survive them. Reginald Dwayne Betts, in his coming-of-age memoir, A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison, meditates on his experience as a Black teenage boy incarcerated in an adult prison, and considers the long duration of Black captivity and the intergenerational dynamics between Black boys and men in prisons. Time, from this perspective, is experienced as a brutal reality of observing countless Black men who entered as youths grow old in prison as newly arriving Black boys continue to enter the system. Betts writes about his own struggle managing the 9 years that he served in various prisons in Virginia. I felt every second that I was behind the walls and bars of the prisons that held me. I felt it in the names that I would go months and months without saying, names I only think of now as I try to tell this story. He discusses the unimaginably long sentences of many of his peers, teenage boys sentenced to 20, 30, 40 years and more, and their various strategies to cope with the idea of living the rest of their lives behind bars. About a fellow prisoner who was sentenced as a teenager to 90 years without parole, Betts writes, Isaac was holding a clock with no hands. Useless clocks also appear in Raymond Towler's painting Passing Time, and they symbolize an unrelenting aspect of penal time, the waiting. Philosopher Lisa Gwinther writes, waiting to do nothing, or waiting to avoid the punishment of further waiting so that one's basic needs or desires can be addressed, is an overwhelming feature of prison temporality, even beyond the most obvious occasion for waiting, for eventual release from prison. The painting was part of what Towler describes as a self-study of the old masters, as they are called, while incarcerated at Lucasville Prison in Ohio. Towler was influenced by Salvador Dali to use a surrealist technique to turn the clocks from objects for measuring time into devices that have no utilitarian value as they melt under the relenting sun. Just my situation, and all this time that I could possibly have to do. I always had hope that I would get out, but I had to be a realist and just know that I had a lot of time. That's the word that you hear 20 times a day, if not 50. I gotta do this time. How much time you got? What time is it? You start keeping time with a calendar instead of a watch. Everything was the same, so it kind of blends in, just like the painting. It all kind of melts together where, even the chow hall, spaghetti Sunday and fish on Friday and chili on Tuesday, for months and years at a time. Fried chicken on Christmas Day and turkey slices on Thanksgiving. The years just blend together. It's all one big blob. Towler, a black man wrongfully convicted of raping, kidnapping, and assaulting a white girl, spent 29 years in prison before being exonerated through the work of Ohio Innocence Project. He managed waiting by studying new artistic styles and experimenting with various media. He sold his art and used the proceeds to help fight his case. Similar to Olatushani, Towler states that he painted his way to freedom. Penal matter refers to the material conditions of imprisonment, which include extreme restrictions on what incarcerated people can possess. In most facilities, possessions are limited to what can fit inside a locked box, on a couple of shelves, or in a small set of drawers. Incarcerated people's access to material items is highly regulated and conditional. In most cases, they can only order goods through state-approved vendors at prices higher than they would be outside prison. In some states, they can receive care packages with supplies from people on their approved senders list. At any moment, however, a person's cell can be inspected and their possessions confiscated by prison staff. Art supplies are minimal in most prisons, and therefore incarcerated people repurpose existing items and experiment with found goods to create. Appropriating existing material and discarding items in the service of art connects the work of incarcerated artists with other groups of marginalized artists and cultural practitioners with limited means and who are excluded from traditional art institutions and markets. For example, art historian Kelly Jones writes of Black artists like Noah Purifoy, who transformed the notion of lack into something useful, aesthetic, and in the service of good, altering trash and shoddiness into that from which beauty flowed. Penal matter also alludes to the body trapped in punitive captivity. Dylan Rodriguez theorizes that the captive is both the state's abstracted legal property, obligation, and intimate bodily possession. Artists like Russell Craig and James Hugh use art to explore how incarcerated people are state property. Hugh makes works that explore the dehumanization of prisoners as they are treated as objects and warehoused as commodities that fuel the business of incarceration, the various companies and entities that benefit from the carceral system. Color, or what I call penal hues, is another crucial element in prison art related to penal matter. It holds enormous significance in U.S. prisons. Certain colors demarcate boundaries that incarcerated people are not allowed to cross. For example, lines painted yellow or orange to designate areas for prison staff only. The color of clothing signals security level in some prisons. Incarcerated people wear different colors based on how they are categorized: minimum, medium, or maximum. The color of clothing also distinguishes the imprisoned from prison staff. Colors can designate age categories in adult prisons, where people under 18 might wear a different uniform than the general prison population. Most significantly, skin color determines who goes to prison, for how long, and the conditions once inside. Although in most prisons, people have restricted access to paints, markers, and other modes of color through the hobby and craft room, by purchasing them through the commissary or through art classes, incarcerated artists are often limited by the options available. Certain colors, like vibrant reds and blues, are not available because they contain chemical compounds like metals or flammable materials that are banned in most prisons. Because of these constraints, incarcerated artists innovate color. They create their own paints, dyes, and stains using existing penal matter. Their experimentations expand their aesthetic environment, given the muted and dull chromatic schemes that exist in most prisons. Incarcerated artists create dyes from hair products, print media, tea, coffee, candy, shoe polish, and Kool-Aid, anything that will dissolve in liquid and result in color. They use found material to transfer color onto other surfaces. They also use color to resist disciplinary control and sensory deprivation, as Latouchani described. Penal space, time, and matter are conditions that continue to shape the art of many formerly imprisoned people even years after their release. Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter's video triptych, Ain't I a Woman?, penned under her performance name Isis the Savior, renders her experience before, during, and after incarceration as a carceral continuum, which she describes as a prison-to-prison pipeline. The title of her video is taken from Sojourner Truth's famous speech denouncing the racial and gender oppression that Black women endure, delivered at the Women's Convention held in Akron, Ohio, in 1851. Baxter links the experiences of contemporary Black women in U.S. prisons to the experiences of enslaved Black women, especially regarding their reproductive labor and the disorganization of the Black family by racial capitalism, demonstrating how the Black body transforms into penal matter and how Black women's reproduction is controlled under the carceral state. Baxter's video reimagines her harrowing experience of being pregnant in prison. She was forced to give birth while shackled for 43 hours during labor. Shortly after she delivered her son, he was taken away from her, and she was placed in administrative segregation, a type of isolation unit often framed as protective custody for ill vulnerable, or abused people, resisting how the regulation of penal space, time, and matter sever Black family relations. Baxter raps, "Nothing can ever come between a mother's love and her offspring. We can't be separated, even through space and time."